Hi, this video is to provide a review of a perfectly competitive market, to go over the components of a perfectly competitive market, and then how you calculate consumer and producer surplus in a perfectly competitive market. So we're going to start with demand. Remember that demand is coming from individual consumers, and those individual consumers have underlying utility functions that tell them how much utility they get from consuming different kinds of goods and services. Often utility will depend on the combination of goods and services that are consumed. But we're not going to go back into that. That's really a sort of micro class concept, and we really want to take it to the next level and take those concepts that you learned in micro and then work on them to be able to analyze the effectiveness of different public policies. So remember all of that, but what we really are going to focus on in this class is just the demand curve itself. So it comes from that underlying utility, but when we focus on demand, we want to think about how the individual's utility translates into a demand for a particular good or service. And so we can first think about an individual. So we can think about an individual's demand for a good, and we always draw demand as a downward sloping curve. And that indicates that the more someone has of an item, the less utility they get from each additional item, or diminishing marginal utility of consumption. This individual demand curve, what I've actually drawn here on this graph, is an inverse demand curve, right? And it's an inverse demand curve because it's in the form of P equals A plus BQ, right? Because I have an intercept here of A. The slope of this curve is equal to B. And so I've graphed it as an inverse demand curve. The demand curve itself would be a curve where quantity is a function of price. And so if we wanted to have quantity all by itself, we would get that by taking the A over to this side, and then of course dividing everything by B, or we could rearrange this and put this in some different terms. We could use something like a beta instead of a B times price minus alpha, right? So that's the way we would show you a demand curve. It would be a function of price. There'd be some constant and some slope associated with that if we graphed it as a demand curve. If we graphed it as a demand curve, of course, we would have to have quantity on the y-axis and price on the x-axis. And so we always graph inverse demand curves. All right, so here we have an inverse demand curve. It's actually very functional in the inverse demand form because it tells us a lot of information. This intercept here, A, shows us the maximum willingness to pay, right? So that no one's willing to pay more than A for any quantity of this good. And then, of course, as the price drops, people are willing to buy more and more. And so each point on this graph tells us for a particular person and a particular consumption, so level of consumption, so maybe this is the 4th unit that an individual has consumed, exactly what their willingness to pay is for that unit, right? And so for, say, this 4th unit, we get their willingness to pay for the 4th unit. So each point on this demand curve is really representing the willingness to pay of an individual consumer for a particular quantity, just 1 unit, but having already consumed a certain number of units. So basically that's our demand curve. So willingness to pay is shown on the demand curve, on the inverse demand curve itself, willingness to pay, or you could also think of it as the value the consumer gets from consuming that unit. So that's our demand curve, pretty easy. This is graphed as an individual's demand curve. When we graph a market, then we just add up all the individuals, and so we'll have a market demand curve that has a similar shape. All right, so let's go from demand to supply. All right, we want to think about where the supply curve comes from. It comes from, instead of the consumer side, it obviously comes from the production side or the seller's side. And when you want to think about this, you want to really think about the underlying cost curves associated with producing goods in a market. And so once again, we're not going to go into all of the cost curves here. We're just going to think about the supply curve itself. The supply curve is generally upward sloping. There may be some situations where supply is either completely horizontal, right, a flat line like this. So I'll do a little picture-in-picture. We could have a supply curve that's horizontal. We could also have a supply curve that's vertical. We'll talk about what those mean in a minute. But when this is the supply curve, this is really representing the marginal cost of production. So we can think about the supply curve as the marginal cost of production. If I'm a seller, I'm going to want to supply a unit as long as the price that I get exceeds my cost for producing it. If the price is greater than my marginal cost of producing, I get a profit. If it's the same, I break even. Obviously, if it's lower, I would lose money, so I don't want to supply if price is less than marginal cost. And so what that gives us is that for a particular unit, say the fourth unit, I can then trace out, and then this is the marginal cost for the fourth unit. So all along the supply curve represents the marginal cost of producing a particular unit of a good, having produced up to that number already. And we say that the supply is generally increasing because there are there's increasing marginal cost, and that comes from diminishing returns to production. When we increase, say, more and more labor, eventually the amount of increased production we're going to get from an additional unit of labor is going to decrease. So that's why we have this sort of generally upward sloping marginal cost curve. Okay, so now let's go to our two exceptions. So here we have the horizontal supply curve. That's where the marginal cost is constant. And so if we're looking at sort of a small range, we might have a constant marginal cost. Or if you're thinking about a production process that's pretty automated, it might have a constant marginal cost. It's also a nice simplification to use when you're really trying to explore other things than how costs are changing. And so often people will just assume constant marginal costs. And we'll do that sometimes in problem sets just to make the calculations easier. Then we have this one here, the vertical supply curve. That basically says that, look, it doesn't matter how high the price is, I'm never going to produce above this quantity. That's where there's some sort of hard constraint. And it could be that you only have a certain amount of input, so you can't go beyond that quantity. It could be that you would have to build a new factory because you're completely at capacity, and that would take several years, and so you basically can't increase supply in the short run. Okay, so those are two of the exceptions. So we've got this upwardly sloping supply curve that represents marginal cost of production. Okay, so there we have the supply side. Okay, let's put the two of them together. All right, so we've got our inverse demand curve, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to call this thing the demand curve all the time. It really doesn't matter. And then we've got this supply curve. This represents marginal cost. The demand curve represents willingness to pay or value. Okay, and we're going to assume that this is a perfectly competitive market. And so we're going to get equilibrium in this market when supply and demand are equal. They're going to be equal at this point. And so we're going to have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. In a perfectly competitive market where there's lots of buyers and lots of sellers, we're going to come to this equilibrium naturally because the market forces are going to drive us there. So say price starts out above the equilibrium somewhere. At this price, right, so let me switch colors on you. So at a high price above equilibrium, right, what we're going to get is that demand is less than supply. So that means that there are a lot of suppliers out there that are not able to sell their product. And many of those suppliers have marginal costs that are below the price. And so they would make a profit if they could sell their units. And so they're going to be willing to actually cut the price that they will take for their good in order to make sure that they're one of the people who gets to sell, since not everybody's going to get to sell in this market. And then that's going to put downward pressure on prices until we get to the equilibrium, at which point there's no incentive for the sellers to drop their price anymore. Okay, so what if we have a low price? Oh, I'm going to warn you that Leo's coming in to see what we're doing, so you're going to see some shadows from him. Leo's my cat, if you haven't met him before on these videos. Okay, so if we have a low price that's below the equilibrium, here what we're going to have is that demand, sorry, Leo's keeps rubbing in front. The demand exceeds supply, and in this case, there are going to be plenty of people who want to buy the product but aren't able to secure it because there's not enough supply. And so they're going to, since their value exceeds the price, they're going to be willing to offer a little bit more to get the good, and that's going to drive the price up, and then we're going to get to equilibrium. Okay, so in these perfectly competitive markets, pretty quickly we get to an equilibrium price and quantity. And if we were solving for this numerically, we would set supply equal to demand, and we would solve for the equilibrium price and quantity. If you want to review that, there's another video that's posted that talks about how to find equilibrium in a market with and without taxes, so check that one out. Okay, so we've got our equilibrium. Let me just get us a clean piece of paper. I know this is not great for conserving paper, but I will use all the backs of those for scratch paper. Okay, so one last time, let's get this drawn. So we've got our demand curve, we've got our supply curve, we've got our equilibrium quantity, and our equilibrium price. Okay, so we want to think about how much surplus is created in this market. We'll start with consumer surplus. Okay, so consumers are going to get surplus when they receive a value from consumption that exceeds the price that they pay. So remember that every point on this demand curve represents a value for a particular customer and a particular unit of the good that they bought. And so for this guy right here, he's going to get consumer surplus that's equal to the difference between the value that he gets from the good and the price he has to pay. And this guy over here is going to get a little bit less. But basically all along here, everybody is getting some consumer surplus. And so we can just fill in this triangle. That's the consumer surplus in the market. And if we wanted to calculate this, we could do it if we in this graphical form. It's the area of the triangle. We just need to compute the height of this triangle and the width of this triangle. And so the area of the triangle is equal to 1/2 times the height times the width. All right, we could also integrate the difference between the willingness to pay, or the value, the inverse demand curve, and the price, if we wanted to use some calculus instead of a geometry. Then for producer surplus, we want to think about the difference between the price that they pay and the marginal cost. Once again, for different sellers and different units, they're going to get different amounts of producer surplus. And then the whole area of producer surplus is the difference between the price paid and the marginal cost of production. Remember, producer surplus is not the same as profit. Profit is going to also take out from, basically you take producer surplus and subtract out any fixed costs, and that'll give you profit. So producer surplus is not equal to profit. Okay, and so total surplus is the combination of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So it's the difference between the value or willingness to pay and the marginal cost. And this is a perfectly competitive market. We have maximized the total surplus in this market, so this market is efficient. If we produced any additional quantity, we'd be producing units where the cost of production would exceed the value, and so we would actually have negative surplus. If we produced any fewer units, we would be ignoring units where the value exceeds the cost, and so we would not have maximized surplus. But we've maximized surplus here because we have produced all units where the value from consuming exceeds the cost of production. And so this is an efficient market, and this is our picture of the perfectly competitive market. So if you have any questions about this, please come see me during office hours, or you can go see the TA during her office hours, and watch it as many times as you need to. All right, thanks a lot. Bye.